Welcome to the session on Introduction to Aesthetics Part 2. Aesthetics is a branch of philosophy concerned with art and beauty. It is a relatively new branch of philosophy that originated in the early 18th century in England and Germany, or 2000 years after the beginnings of other branches of Western philosophy which began in Greece around 600 BC. Aesthetic, as the study of art and beauty, is closely related to the concept of aesthetic experience. Alexander Baumgarten, during 1714 to 1762, who coined the term aesthetics, argues that human experience the world in one of two fundamentally different ways, logically and aesthetically. Logical experience is the most common way in which we see and experience things by classifying them in practically useful ways. Aesthetic experience, by contrast, is looking at things for their own sake. Just think about how we enjoy looking at a rose or watching a sunset. The main question for aesthetic as a branch of philosophy is, what is the nature of aesthetic experience? You don't have an aesthetic experience because the object you are looking at is beautiful or because it is a work of art, but it is beautiful because you are looking at aesthetically. It is art because it has been made to be looked at aesthetically. Art and beauty, therefore, according to the 18th century aesthetic investigations, are subjective and psychological. They do not exist objectively as properties of object, but only as human ways of perceiving objects. But because our sense organs are similar, our experiences, though subjective, are roughly similar. So, even though aesthetic qualities are subjective and psychological and culturally relative, they can be explained as potentially universal for all humans. According to the 18th and 19th century tradition of aesthetics, what we call art is those objects made by people to be enjoyed aesthetically. The early Paleolithic people who produced the famous cave paintings did not make them simply to be viewed, but for ritual, ceremonial and religious purposes. But today we appreciate it as work of arts, though the people who made it never thought of it that way. We may call this art before art, since art created as art, not as religious icons. Aesthetic experience and aesthetics, as the study of aesthetic experience, are notions that have not always existed since the dawn of human society or since the beginning of Western civilization. It is a relatively new development. Though aesthetics as a study of aesthetic experience is a new development, the question of beauty, which is also included in this field, has always been a perennial issue for the philosophers since Plato. So, we have to consider these twin concerns, that is, the theory of beauty and the theory of art separately. Now, as an introduction to the subject aesthetics, let us try to outline the basic historical roots along which the problems of aesthetics have evolved. As I have already mentioned, we have two major divisions in this session, the theory of beauty and the theory of art. We will start with the theory of beauty. Western theories of beauty start with famous Greek philosopher Plato during 428 to 348 BC. He has included beauty as a theme of discussion in his book Symposium. According to the Platonic philosophy, beauty transcends the world of sense experience, which means that the experience of beauty is unlike what would be described as aesthetics experience today. Plato draws a sharp line between beautiful things which we see, hear or touch in the world of sense and beauty itself, which exists apart from the world of sights and sounds in what Plato calls the intelligible world. However, further he tries to discover the properties that all beautiful things have in common in the world of senses. There are beautiful things which are simple and beautiful things which are complex. The simple things have unity in common, and the complex things have measures and proportion of parts in common, which is also a form of unity. But he does not think that the word beauty and the word unity are identical in meaning. Something is beautiful in virtue of its participation in the form of beauty, which is an ultimate abstract level. Aristotle, during 384 to 322 BC, a student and contemporary of Plato, rejected the Platonic view that the forms transcend the world of experience and exist in their own distinct realm. Aristotle maintained that the forms were embodied in nature as we experienced it and that they had no independent existence. For Aristotle, the world as we sensuously experience it is no basic way illusory, and his philosophy provides a basis for an interest in the phenomena of both nature and art. The next important philosopher is Plotinus during 204 to 269 BC. Plotinus' mysticism emphasizes even more strongly than Plato's philosophy the illusoriness of the world of sense. Plotinus accepts Plato's theory of forms and holds that the world of senses to some limited degree reflects and reveals the forms to contemplation. He, like Plato, argues that experience of beauty itself is not a sensuous experience but an intellectual one. Contemplation is the central idea in both Plato and Plotinus. But contemplation, they mean a kind of meditation in which a person has the object of his awareness some non-sensuous entity, for example, the form of beauty. It is in the works of St. Thomas Aquinas during 1225 to 1274 AD that Aristotelian philosophy received its most influential expression. Aquinas' conception of beauty is not an unworldly one. He defines beauty as that which pleases when seen. He also attempts to isolate the properties of objects which do please. He concludes that the conditions of beauty are three: perfection or unimpairedness, proportion or harmony, and brightness or clarity. Aquinas' theory has both subjective and objective aspects. The conditions of beauty are objective features of the world of experience, but the idea of pleasing as part of the meaning of beauty is a subjective element. According to Aquinas, in the experience of beauty, the mind grasps a form which is embodied in the object of the experience. For example, the mind grasps the form of hoarseness when the object experienced is a horse. As we have already seen, the 18th century was a critical time in the history of aesthetics. During this period, a number of British philosophers worked on the concept of taste and provided the basis for aesthetics in its modern form. Prior to this period, it was generally assumed that beauty named an objective property of things, either a transcendental or an empirical property depending on the theory. But the 18th century philosophers of taste shifted the focus of aesthetic theory. In order to furnish a basis for objective judgments of beauty, they concentrated on the elite faculty or faculties with which men react to certain features of the objective world. In George Dickey's words, the apparatus of taste is conceived of by some of them to be a special single faculty, that is the sense of beauty, by some to be composed of several special faculties, the sense of beauty, the sense of the sublime, and so on, and by some as simply the ordinary cognitive and affective faculties functioning in an unusual way. In short, these thinkers turn their attention in on the subject, that is human being, and analyze the states of subject's mind and his mental faculties. Another important development in 18th century was the introduction of the notions of the sublime and the picturesque into the aesthetic theory. Shaftesbury during 1671 to 1713 was one of the first 18th century thinkers to focus attention on the sublime. According to Shaftesbury, The vastness and incomprehensibility of the creation of God can only be described as sublime. He classified the sublime as one kind of beauty. Another important contribution of Shaftesbury is the introduction of the notion of disinterestedness. He argues that selfish or interested desires, of which the desire for possession is a paradigm, are destructive of aesthetic appreciation. In the theory of the British aesthetician Francis Hutcheson during 1694 to 1746, we see no trace of Platonic transcendentalism. His theory focuses on the phenomena of sense. In his view, the word beauty names neither a transcendental object nor any objects which is seen, heard or touched. Beauty names an idea raised in us, that is, it denotes an object in our private consciousness which is aroused by the perception of certain kinds of external objects. By the sense of beauty, he means a power or ability to have aroused in a mind the idea or feeling of beauty. Edmund Burke's during 1728 to 1797 book on the sublime and beautiful is a seminal work in the field of aesthetics. He regards the sublime as opposed to beauty. He rejects the theory of special internal senses and tries to make the ordinary pleasure and pain the basis for beauty and the sublime. The pleasure taken in beauty is love, that is positive pleasure, and this pleasure is generally related to the passions useful for the preservation of society. The pleasure taken in the sublime is delight, that is relative pleasure, and is generally related to the passion useful for the preservation of the individual. It is not so easy to understand the theory of beauty proposed by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant during 1724 to 1804, as he organizes his idea according to a complex system of philosophy bristled with technical terms. However, let us try to summarize his major ideas. Kant uses the term aesthetic in a very broader sense to include not only judgments of beauty and sublime, but also judgments of pleasure in general. For Kant, all aesthetic judgments focus on pleasure and it is subjective. Pleasure does not play a role in the cognition of the objective world external to the subject. He also thinks that such judgments are stable and universal in a way that other pleasures are not. He divides the discussion of his theory into 4 parts, each of which treats a major concept. These concepts are disinterestedness, universality, the form of purpose and necessity. The theory may be summarized as: a judgment of beauty is a disinterested, universal and necessary judgment concerning the pleasure which everyone ought to derive from the experience of form. In this theory, the concepts of disinterestedness, universality and necessity are primarily involved with the experiencing subject. But the 4th concept, the form of purpose, focuses on the object of appreciation. He asserts that it is the recognition of the form of purpose, not recognition of the purpose itself, which evokes the beauty experience. For example, the design of a painting is the result of purposive activity of a human agent, whereas the forms of nature are the result of purposive activity of God. Before the 18th century, beauty was a central concept. During the century, it was replaced by the concept of taste. By the end of the century, the concept of the taste had been overrun by the concept of aesthetics. Now, we will turn to the other strain in the history of aesthetics, the theory of art. In this chapter, we will mainly discuss the imitation theory of art put forward by Plato and Aristotle, and the expression theory of art, a 19th century view which was the first theory to challenge the dominance of the imitation theory. The major difference between these two theories is that the imitation theory of Plato and Aristotle focuses attention on the objective properties of the work of art, that is, It is object-centered, whereas the expression theory of art shifts the attention away from the work of art to the artist. It is artist-centered. In the Republic, Plato says that an artisan who makes a chair imitates the form of chairness from the intelligible world, and an artist who paints a picture of the chair imitates the chair. There are then two levels of imitation. He asserts that artists are two times away from the truth, so that art cannot be a good source of knowledge. Aristotle, however, takes a direct interest in the art, or rather various genres of art such as tragedy and comedy. His main contribution to aesthetics is his Poetics, which is concerned with three genres of art: tragedy, comedy and epic poetry. The Poetics is basically a theory of literature and theatre. He has no hostility toward the world of sense as such, and consequently toward art which imitates the world of sense. He also proposes a subjective element known as catharsis in his theory of imitation. According to this, tragedy purges the spectator of pity and fear, and he leaves the theatre free of such emotions. In the beginning of 19th century, the imitation theory was called in question. During this period, the theory that art is the expression of emotion of the artist came to be the dominant view. The rise of the expression theory of art is related to Romanticism, an important intellectual and philosophical development of the 18th and 19th centuries. The main philosophical doctrines behind Romanticism were those of Fichte, Schelling, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Romanticism may be thought of as a reaction against empiricist philosophy and the scientific mentality, and as an attempt to reach behind the sensuousness of ordinary knowledge. In this context, emotion assumes an important role it had not previously had. It attained the privileged stature of a superior knowledge. Art began to be considered as the vehicle of this knowledge and competitor of science. The idea of the expression theory of art can be summarized as: art is expression of the emotion of its creator. Eugene Veron writes late in the 19th century, art is the manifestation of emotion obtaining external interpretation, now by expressive arrangement of line, form or color, now by a series of gestures, sounds or words governed by particular rhythmic cadence. Leo Tolstoy's version of expression theory brings reference to spectators, readers and the like into the definition of art. Art is a human activity consisting in this, that one man consciously, by means of some external signs, hands on to other feelings he has lived through, and that other peoples are infected by these feelings and also experience them. Now, let us sum up the three important accomplishments of this theory. 1. It re-established for art a central place in Western culture. 2. It related art to the lives of the people. 3. It attempted to account for the emotional qualities of art and the way in which art moves people. I hope you have got an elementary knowledge of aesthetics and the evolution of aesthetic ideas through ages from our brief discussion. However, what I have been left out in this session also needs your attention. For instance, recent developments in the field of aesthetics have introduced a new area of study called the philosophy of criticism or metacriticism, which is conceived of as a philosophical activity which analyzes and clarifies the basic concept used by the art critics when they describe, interpret or evaluate particular works of art. So I think you enjoyed the session. Bye.